I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing before the massive walls of Sacsayhuamán, feeling the weight of perfectly fitted stones that have defied earthquakes for over 5 centuries. The morning mist clings to the ancient fortress overlooking Cusco, and as you run your hand along the seamless joints, you hear something that makes your blood freeze. A whisper carried on the wind, speaking in a language lost to time. We think we know the Inca Empire as master builders, creators of Machu Picchu, engineers who moved 20-ton blocks without wheels or iron tools. But the truth is far more chilling than any tourist guidebook will tell you. These walls, these magnificent testaments to human achievement, hold a secret so dark that archaeologists still struggle to discuss it publicly. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar revealed what locals had whispered about for generations. Deep within the walls of Cusco's most sacred structures, human remains rest in impossible positions. Bodies that were never meant to be found, because they were never meant to be buried. They were entombed alive, conscious and breathing, as liquid mortar filled the spaces around them and massive stones sealed their fate forever. The practice had a name in Quechua, Capacocha Rumimanta, the sacred offering to the stone spirits. Between 1438 and 1533, during the height of Inca power, an estimated 2,400 people met this fate across the empire. They weren't executed and then placed in walls. They were built into them, watching helplessly as daylight disappeared block by block, their final moments becoming part of the very foundations of an empire. Dr. Maria Constanza Cerruti, who led the 2019 investigation, made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about Inca justice. Using advanced forensic techniques on remains found in Cusco's Qorikancha temple walls, her team determined that at least 67 individuals showed signs of having been conscious during the entombment process. Fingernail scratches on stone surfaces, twisted limbs indicating desperate movement, and most horrifyingly, evidence of prolonged survival. Some victims lived for up to 18 hours after the sealing began. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a calculated system of punishment and spiritual manipulation that served multiple purposes in Inca society. Traitors, rebels, and those who betrayed the divine authority of the Sapa Inca faced this ultimate sentence. But it wasn't just about death. It was about capturing their life force, their ani, and binding it eternally to serve the empire they betrayed. The Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de Leon, writing in 1553, recorded testimonies from Inca survivors who described the selection process. Victims were chosen not just for their crimes, but for their spiritual strength. The Incas believed that a powerful soul, trapped in stone, would strengthen the walls against both physical and supernatural threats. The stronger the betrayer, the more valuable their eternal imprisonment became. The year was 1471, and Tupac Inca Yupanqui faced the greatest crisis of his reign. The Chanca Confederation, supposedly conquered a generation earlier, had risen in rebellion, threatening the very heart of the empire from their strongholds in the Apurimac region. But this wasn't just military defiance. 3 high-ranking Inca nobles had joined the rebellion, providing inside knowledge of imperial defenses and sacred protocols. When the rebellion was finally crushed after 18 months of brutal warfare, Tupac Inca faced a dilemma that would reshape Inca justice forever. Simple execution wasn't enough for traitors who had violated not just political loyalty, but sacred trust. These weren't common criminals. They were Panica members, descendants of previous Sapa Incas, who had committed the ultimate sin of betraying their divine blood. The solution came from the Amautas, the philosopher priests who served as the empire's intellectual elite. Drawing from pre-Inca traditions of human sacrifice and the Andean concept of ani, reciprocal obligation, they proposed something unprecedented. If these traitors had used their life force against the empire, that same life force could be captured and redirected to serve imperial purposes forever. The first recorded live burial took place at Ollantaytambo in late 1471. The victim was Chuyamarca, a noble who provided the Chancas with detailed information about Inca military strategies. According to Spanish chronicler Juan de Betanzos, who interviewed eyewitnesses decades later, the process was meticulously planned and spiritually choreographed. Chuyamarca was brought to a partially constructed wall at dawn, bound not with ropes but with gold wire, a material considered sacred and unbreakable. As construction resumed around him, priests performed continuous chants designed to weaken his spiritual resistance while strengthening the stones that would become his eternal prison. The process took nearly 8 hours, with workers placing each stone according to precise astronomical alignments. What made this execution uniquely horrifying was its deliberate prolongation. Unlike other forms of capital punishment that sought swift death, live burial was designed to maximize the victim's conscious experience. Breathing holes were initially left in construction, allowing condemned to survive for hours or even days as the wall gradually compressed around them. Their terror, their regret, their final acceptance, all of it was considered essential to the spiritual transformation that would bind their Aini to the structure. The success of Chuyamarca's entombment was measured not just by his death, but by the wall's subsequent performance. When Spanish conquistador Hernando Pizarro later bombarded Ollantaytambo with cannons in 1537, that particular section remained intact while adjacent areas crumbled. To Inca observers, this was proof that the system worked. The traitors' captured life force was indeed strengthening imperial defenses. Word of the new punishment spread throughout the empire via the Chasca message system, carried along with detailed instructions for proper implementation. By 1475, construction sites from Quito to Chile were incorporating live burial chambers into their architectural plans. The practice became so institutionalized that specialized Rumimanta Purichik, literally, those who walk stone dwellers, emerged as a distinct class of executioner architects. But the system's true innovation lay in its psychological impact. Traditional Inca justice focused on community shame and physical punishment. Live burial introduced something far more terrifying: the complete erasure of individual agency combined with eternal service. Victims didn't just die. They became unwilling guardians of the very system they betrayed. The practice quickly expanded beyond political traitors. Religious heretics, military deserters, and even nobles who violated marriage customs found themselves facing the stone tombs. Each category of crime required specific ritual modifications. Traitors were buried facing toward Cusco in perpetual submission, while religious criminals faced away, symbolically banished from the empire's spiritual center. By 1480, live burial had become so central to Inca justice that architectural planning always included designated Capacocha spaces. These weren't afterthoughts or crude cells, but precisely engineered chambers that maximized both the victim's suffering and the wall's structural benefit from their spiritual presence. But the most chilling aspect was how quickly the practice normalized within imperial culture. What began as an extreme response to an extraordinary crisis became routine administrative procedure within a single generation. The Spanish would later describe these walls as speaking stones, now understanding that they were literally correct. The morning of February 15th, 1489, began like any other in the royal palace of Cusco until the drums started beating in the pattern that froze every heart within 50 miles. 3 long beats, followed by 7 short ones, then silence. The Capacocha selection had begun. Atahualpa Inca, not the future emperor, but a lesser noble sharing the name, was conducting his daily administrative duties when the Takrikak arrived. These weren't ordinary officials, but priest-judges whose authority in matters of imperial betrayal was absolute and unappealable. Their presence meant someone's fate had already been sealed by forces beyond human intervention. The selection process that had evolved since 1471 was neither random nor emotional. It followed strict protocols established by the Yachaywasi, the house of learning where imperial philosophy was developed and codified. Every potential victim underwent evaluation across 7 criteria, each carrying precise numerical weights that determined their suitability for live burial. First came Elu status, family lineage and social position. Commoners could be executed traditionally, but nobles required special handling to prevent their ancestral spirits from seeking revenge. The more prestigious the bloodline, the greater the spiritual power that could be captured through proper entombment. Royal family members rated the highest values, followed by provincial governors, then military commanders. Second was the nature of the betrayal. Simple theft or adultery might warrant death, but rarely live burial. However, sharing sacred information with enemies, revealing the locations of huacas, holy sites, or corrupting religious ceremonies triggered automatic consideration. The betrayal had to represent a fundamental violation of the spiritual order, not merely social rules. Third came physical and mental fitness. This criterion shocked even hardened Spanish chroniclers when they learned of it. The condemned needed to be healthy enough to survive the initial stages of entombment, typically 6 to 12 hours, to ensure their spiritual energy remained strong during the crucial binding phase. Sick or injured traitors were often healed before execution to maximize their usefulness. The fourth factor was astrological timing. Inca astronomers calculated precise dates when the alignment of celestial bodies would enhance the spiritual transfer process. The victim's birth date, the nature of their crime, and current astronomical conditions had to harmonize for optimal results. This meant some condemned individuals waited months in specially constructed holding cells, while priests calculated the perfect execution window. Fifth was architectural need. Not every wall required spiritual reinforcement, and not every sacred site needed guardian spirits. Military fortifications received priority, followed by temples, then administrative buildings. The victim's spiritual profile had to match the structure's intended purpose. Warriors for military walls, priests for temple foundations, administrators for government buildings. Sixth came community impact. Live burial served as both punishment and deterrent, but its effectiveness depended on public awareness without public disruption. Victims were chosen partly based on how their disappearance would affect imperial stability. Too prominent, and their entombment might inspire sympathy or rebellion. Too obscure, and the deterrent effect would be minimal. The seventh and most complex factor was spiritual resistance. Through interrogation techniques that combined psychological pressure with hallucinogenic compounds, priests evaluated each candidate's ability to maintain their essential life force under extreme stress. Paradoxically, the strongest-willed individuals made the best victims because their captured spirits would provide more powerful protection. Once selection was complete, the condemned entered a 40-day preparation period called Capacocha Rumimanta, the breathing before offering. This was imprisonment, but a carefully managed transition designed to optimize their spiritual value. They received improved food, medical care, and even limited social interaction to keep their life force strong, while gradually breaking their emotional ties to the living world. During this period, they were required to memorize specific prayers and chants that would help guide the spiritual transfer process. Many victims reported later, through medium sessions conducted by surviving priests, that they began experiencing prophetic dreams and enhanced spiritual awareness as their approaching transformation affected their consciousness. The most disturbing aspect of the selection protocol was its bureaucratic efficiency. The system processed an average of 47 cases per year across the empire, with detailed records maintained on quipu knot strings. These weren't emotional decisions driven by anger or revenge, but calculated choices made through systematic evaluation of spiritual, political, and architectural factors. By 1520, the selection process had become so refined that regional governors could predict with 90% accuracy which types of crimes will result in live burial versus traditional execution. The system's predictability became part of its psychological power. Potential traitors knew exactly what awaited them if they crossed clearly defined lines. But the most chilling discovery came from Spanish missionary records in the 1540s. When interviewing surviving Inca priests about their practices, several mentioned that some victims actually requested live burial over traditional execution. They believed that eternal service to the empire was preferable to the spiritual exile that followed conventional death. The stones were calling, and some chose to answer willingly. Her name was Qorikancha, and she had been the most beautiful woman in the Antasiu province until the morning she made a choice that would echo through stone for centuries. The year was 1491, and she was 23 years old, a mother of 3 young children, when Spanish advance scouts first appeared in the Amazon territories disguised as harmless merchants. What Qorikancha did next would have been unremarkable in any other civilization. She provided food and shelter to strangers who claimed to be travelers seeking passage to distant markets. But these weren't ordinary strangers. The seemingly innocent information she shared about local gold deposits, population centers, and seasonal travel patterns would soon reach conquistador ears through a network of indigenous informants, making her technically guilty of aiding potential enemies of the empire. Spanish chronicler Pedro Pizarro recorded her story after interviewing her widowed husband in 1534, gathering details that would later shock even hardened conquistadors. Qorikancha spent her 40-day preparation period writing letters to her 3 young children, documents that were preserved and later translated by Spanish missionaries attempting to understand the psychological sophistication of Inca execution methods. "My beloved Chuya," she wrote to her eldest daughter in carefully formed Quechua script, "when the stones embrace me, remember that Mama chose to feed hungry strangers because Aini demands we show kindness to all who walk under Inti's light. The Amautas tell me my spirit will guard our Elu forever. Do not weep for Mama's body. It served the empire now, and through service achieves immortality." But Qorikancha's letters also revealed the sophisticated psychological preparation victims received during their confinement. Over 40 days, she was gradually introduced to breathing exercises specifically designed to extend survival time in low-oxygen environments, memorized complex chants that would supposedly ease the spiritual transition from human to architectural guardian, and practice advanced visualization methods developed by imperial priests to help condemned individuals psychologically accept their transformation into living building materials. "The walls speak to me now in my dreams," she wrote in her final letter, composed just hours before her scheduled entombment. "I understand that I will not die, but transform into something greater. My fear becomes strength for our people. My breath becomes wind through the stones. My heartbeat becomes eternal rhythm that holds the empire together against all enemies." The technical details of her entombment, meticulously recorded by the Quipakamaic, who served as official witness to proceedings, revealed the horrifying precision with which these executions were conducted according to imperial protocol. Qorikancha was positioned in a specially constructed niche within the wall of a new administrative center, seated in a traditional meditation position with her hands bound by sacred gold wire to prevent involuntary movement that might disrupt the delicate spiritual transfer process. Construction resumed at dawn on the appointed day, with master craftsmen placing stones according to intricate geometric patterns that left carefully calculated air gaps. She remained conscious and audible for approximately 14 hours, during which time priests maintained continuous ceremonial chant and offered her measured portions of coca leaves to sustain her strength throughout the spiritual integration phase. Her final words, "Tell Chuya the stones sing lullabies," were recorded with the same clinical precision used for tax assessments. 3 years later, when Spanish forces launched their assault on the administrative center, where Qorikancha was entombed, that particular section of wall proved unusually resistant to cannon fire and siege equipment. Local Inca defenders reported hearing a woman's voice during the most intense bombardments, singing traditional Taki songs that gave them supernatural courage to continue fighting against overwhelming odds. Spanish soldiers later testified that their weapons seemed to malfunction, specifically when aimed at that wall section. But the most tragic case was 15-year-old Ila Chuya, accused of profaning temple ceremonies by revealing sacred rituals to her lover from a subordinate ethnic group. Her youth made her spiritually powerful but psychologically fragile, creating special challenges with standard preparation protocols. The priest developed modified psychological conditioning techniques specifically for younger victims, using elaborate storytelling rather than meditation to prepare them mentally for their transformation into architectural guardians. Ila Chuya was told enchanting tales of how she would become a protective spirit watching over future generations of children, ensuring that no other young people would face similar accusations of religious impropriety. Her final recorded words, spoken just before the stone sealed her chamber forever, revealed both the system's psychological sophistication and its ultimate cruelty. "I'm not afraid anymore. The stories made it beautiful. I'll be the wind that plays with children's hair during summer festivals." These weren't just executions. They were carefully orchestrated transformations of human terror into architectural strength. By 1505, under Huayna Capac's reign, live burial had evolved into the empire's most sophisticated tool of political control. The practice had spread to over 400 locations across the Inca realm, creating a network of spiritually reinforced architecture that seemed to make the empire immortal. Between 1500 and 1525 alone, over 800 individuals were entombed alive in various imperial structures. This represented the systematic implementation of a grand strategy that would have reshaped human civilization if the Spanish conquest hadn't intervened. Huayna Capac's innovation was connecting live burial sites through what researchers call the spiritual defense network. Each entombed victim was positioned to participate in a vast supernatural communication system. Locations were chosen using astronomical calculations that aligned burial sites with celestial events, creating spiritual transmission lines spanning thousands of miles. The emperor's personal architect, Tupac, left detailed plans carved into gold plates that Spanish conquistadors melted down, but not before missionary scholars copied portions. These fragments, discovered in Vatican archives in 1987, reveal the breathtaking scope of the project. Each new center was designed around a central heart chamber, where the most powerful spirits would be housed. These weren't simple burial niches, but complex architectural systems that channeled air, sound, and spiritual energy through precisely calculated passages connecting to similar chambers in distant structures. The most ambitious example was Cusco's reconstruction between 1510 and 1520. Huayna Capac ordered systematic replacement of existing walls with spiritually enhanced versions, requiring the entombment of 127 carefully selected victims whose combined spiritual power would make the capital literally indestructible. Each victim was matched to their architectural location through an elaborate classification system. Warriors were placed in outer defensive walls, their aggressive spirits directed outward against enemies. Priests were entombed in temple foundations, their spiritual knowledge enhancing religious ceremonies conducted above. Every entombment was followed by extensive testing to verify spiritual integration had succeeded. Priests used hallucinogenic compounds and acoustic techniques to communicate with newly entombed spirits and confirm they were performing assigned duties. The psychological effects on imperial society were profound. Buildings weren't just structures, but supernatural entities with consciousness, memory, and power. This created architectural reverence that made rebellion seem not just treasonous, but literally insane. Who would attack walls that could think and retaliate? By 1520, imperial law required all major construction projects to include at least one spiritual integration. The practice had evolved from punishment into essential infrastructure, as fundamental to Inca building as stone cutting. The empire was becoming literally alive through thousands of unwilling human spirits trapped in stone prisons across 2 continents. November 16th, 1532. The day Francisco Pizarro captured Emperor Atahualpa marked not just conquest beginning, but the moment when centuries of accumulated spiritual architecture began collapsing in ways conquistadors couldn't understand. Within hours of Atahualpa's capture, Spanish soldiers reported disturbing phenomena throughout the empire. Walls that had stood for generations suddenly developed cracks. Temperatures dropped dramatically in buildings that had maintained supernatural warmth for decades. Most unsettling, multiple witnesses reported hearing thousands of voices screaming from within the stones themselves. Brother Vicente de Valverde recorded these incidents in letters to Spain. The very stones seemed possessed by demons. He wrote in December 1532, "Our presence causes such anguish that the buildings themselves weep and wail. We have witnessed walls bleeding, floors trembling without earthquake, and voices speaking in tongues no Christian ear should hear." What Valverde interpreted as demonic activity was actually catastrophic failure of the spiritual network connecting live burial sites. The Sapa Inca's capture had severed supernatural communications links that allowed entombed spirits to coordinate their activities. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Buildings that had been spiritually reinforced for decades suddenly lost their supernatural structural support. In Cusco, wall sections that had resisted earthquakes for generations crumbled without warning. Sacsayhuamán developed stress fractures following no known pattern of structural failure. Spanish chronicler Pedro Pizarro described scenes that haunted him forever. As our forces entered each city, the stones would begin to sing. Not music, but the sound of men and women crying out as if buried alive. Our horses would not approach certain walls, and our dogs howled in terror near the largest buildings. The systematic destruction of Inca religious sites inadvertently triggered mass spiritual releases that turned conquest into supernatural warfare. When Spanish forces demolished temples to build churches, they unknowingly freed hundreds of entombed spirits simultaneously. The psychological impact on surviving Incas was catastrophic. They believed they were witnessing the world's end as their ancestors literally screamed from the rubble. The most dramatic incident occurred during Cusco's Qorikancha temple destruction in 1534. Spanish soldiers used hammers and crowbars to dismantle walls containing remains of over 40 entombed priests and nobles. The demolition process was accompanied by acoustic phenomena so disturbing that several conquistadors fled and refused to return. Indigenous resistance took on supernatural dimensions as surviving Inca priests attempted to weaponize the spiritual crisis. Manco Inca's 1536 rebellion specifically targeted Spanish-occupied buildings with known live burial sites, hoping to trigger spirit releases that would terrify conquistadors into retreat. By 1540, systematic destruction of spiritually enhanced architecture had effectively eliminated the live burial network that had taken nearly a century to construct. But the psychological and supernatural trauma of its collapse would echo through Andean culture for generations. The stones had finally fallen silent, but their silence was more terrifying than their screams. Today, as you walk through Cusco or climb Machu Picchu's terraces, you're experiencing something unprecedented. Architecture designed to be literally alive, built with human consciousness integrated into its foundation. Modern ground-penetrating radar continues revealing new chambers, new remains, new evidence of a practice so systematic it redefined the relationship between the living and built environment. The psychological techniques developed by Inca priests wouldn't seem out of place in modern psychological warfare manuals. The architectural innovations that allowed human remains to strengthen stone structures still challenge our understanding of engineering principles. The spiritual network connecting burial sites across thousands of miles represented distributed consciousness that anticipated modern computer networks by 5 centuries. But perhaps most disturbing is how quickly a sophisticated civilization normalized systematic torture and murder of its own people for architectural advancement. The bureaucratic efficiency with which Incas processed live burial cases mirrors the administrative precision of history's worst genocides. Even today, construction workers in Peru report unsettling experiences at archaeological sites. Building projects near ancient ruins encounter unexplained delays, equipment failures, and worker superstitions forcing schedule changes. Local communities maintain traditions of asking permission from stone spirits before beginning construction. Modern Peru's relationship with its pre-Columbian heritage remains complicated by knowledge of what lies beneath tourist attractions. Archaeological teams employ counselors to help workers cope with discovering human remains in wall cavities. Government regulations require spiritual cleansing ceremonies before excavations that might disturb entombed remains. The practice reveals something fundamental about human nature transcending cultural boundaries. When civilizations convince themselves that individual lives are less important than collective goals, whether architectural, political, or spiritual, the capacity for systematic cruelty becomes limitless. This wasn't just about architecture. It was about society's willingness to sacrifice their most vulnerable members to maintain systems of control. And even today, it still echoes in every wall that whispers and every stone that remembers the voices trapped within.